welcome back to the ReidConnect-Ed podcast, co-hosted by myself, educational therapist Alexis Reid, and my brother, licensed psychologist Gerald Reid. We're providing you with an expert and nuanced discussion on topics relevant to mental health, education, and sport and performance psychology.
Today's topic is about character development. And no, we're not talking about a book or a movie character. We're talking about character in the sense of the qualities or traits that make up an individual. But what does it really mean to have character? We're going to get into the depths of understanding what this idea of character is. We're going to talk about character development, the ways that schools and institutions and people in young people's lives can really facilitate this idea of character traits and character development.
So today we're joined by Drs. Scott Seider and Shelby Clark. Scott Seider is an applied developmental psychologist whose research focuses on how parents and educators can support young people's identity development and civic development. In one stream of research, Dr. Seider investigates how parents leading mixed race, mixed heritage, and mixed faith families engage their children in cultural and religious socialization. In a second stream of research, Dr. Seider explores how educators can support their students' development of civic skills, character strengths, and critical consciousness necessary to recognize, analyze, and challenge injustice. He's the author and co-author of numerous articles and books, including Educating for Justice from 2025, Schooling for Critical Consciousness, published in 2020, and Character Compass, published both in 2012 and the new issue in 2026. At Boston College, my alma mater, Dr. Seider teaches undergraduate and graduate courses focused on adolescent development, transformative teaching and learning, qualitative research methods, one of my favorite classes, and social oppression and transformation. He previously worked as an English teacher in the Boston Public Schools and as a teacher educator at Boston University. Dr. Seider also serves on advisory boards for a number of youth-serving organizations, including the Center for Parent and Teen Communication, EL Education, and the Journal of Adolescent Research.
Dr. Shelby Clark is a principal investigator at Project Zero and a project director on the Good Project. She currently co-leads the implementation of the Good Project lesson plans, investigating how engaging in a community of practice impacts teachers' implementation of the Good Project's lesson plans and the lesson plans' impact on students' character growth and the ability to do good work. Shelby's work focuses on the development of intellectual, moral, and civic character strengths in adolescent and young adults with a focus on strengths such as curiosity, open-mindedness, and social responsibility. She received her PhD in Applied Human Development at Boston University and a master's from the George Washington University in School Counseling and a BA in History and Music from Johns Hopkins University. Shelby formerly worked as a school counselor in St. Paul, Minnesota. And we are so happy to have you both here today to join the podcast and to really share your expertise and just the depth and breadth of knowledge of this idea of character development that I think maybe gets thrown around in society on a superficial level or kind of a surface level, maybe through social media, but we're really here to have a more nuanced, in-depth discussion, and I'm really excited to have your knowledge to be shared today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So let's start with the very practical question. So in universal design for learning, it's let's define our terms early so we don't lose people in the conversation. So I wonder, can we define what character is? How do we actually define it?
So I think, there's lots of different ways of defining character, but I think one that we use in our book, Character Compass, is the qualities that motivate and enable people to act in ways that benefit themselves and others, right? And some, and so different people in organizations focus on different elements of that definition, right? Some focus on the character strengths and qualities necessary to motivate. Others focus more on the character strengths and qualities necessary to develop particular skills. Some people focus more on what are the qualities that enable you as an individual to thrive. Other people and institutions focus more on the qualities that enable an individual to kind of work on behalf of others. But we think all of that kind of constitutes character. It is both the motivational skills and the sort of the skills, for lack of a better word. It's both the qualities that enable an individual to thrive, like, on, themselves, but also to, to support the thriving of others.
As you're defining all of this, I'm thinking a lot about developmental psychology in general, that some of the most difficult terms to fully describe often encompass so much, right? I really loved the images that were in the book that were like, this is character, and here are the component parts and the different categories that also go into building and understanding character. I wonder if there's anything more that you think helps to conceptualize it, because it feels like so much. And also it's at the core of almost everything, in my opinion.
Yeah, in the book, we have an image where we talk about how character is made up of the cognitive, the affective, and the behavioral. So really, we'll talk more about the moral, performance, civic, and intellectual as well. But really, there's the thinking, there's the feeling, and the behaviors that go along with it. And really, people also talk about it a lot of times as the head, the heart, and the hand. And so I think that that's something that you'll hear tossed around in the character literature a lot. And you see that a lot in a lot of different psychological literature. It comes out in a lot of different ways, but it happens in our character as well, because it is something that really brings up all of these different elements of who we are. It's, it requires what we think about, it's our motivations. It also is the skills, that's the behavioral element. And the affective element is that motivation. And are we actually thinking that we want to behave in a way that is good, is helpful for others, is sort of towards the good, which is sort of the motivational aspect of it.
If I could just add one thing that, that Shelby kind of alluded to, I started with this sort of very broad definition of character. And I think that's something that educators and parents and counselors have found useful, and Shelby alluded to this, is sort of parsing the idea of character into 4 elements, like the moral, the performance, the civic, and the intellectual. And, so in other words, when some folks talk about character, like what they really want to focus in on are moral qualities like integrity and empathy, that allow individuals to kind of engage in ethical relationships with others, right? It's like other folks, when they're talking about character, they really are talking about qualities that support performance, whether that's like tenacity or perseverance, that enable a person to kind of push through challenges. Like, still other people, when they're talking about character, they're interested in the civic. Like, they're really interested in qualities like, collaboration and teamwork and social responsibility that allow individuals to fulfill responsibilities to a community. And last but not least, like some folks, when they're talking about character, what they're really interested in sort of intellectual qualities like curiosity and intellectual humility that are sort of the qualities of a powerful learner. And so I think that sort of way of parsing character into different dimensions, I think, can allow us to have much more specific conversations about what a school or a family or an organization is trying to accomplish with its character work.
To operationalize it and help it play out in different ways that you can see results in developing some of these aspects and attributes of individuals. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
thank you.
It reminds me a lot of how we're thinking about athletes now. There's always been kind of this push towards excellence and being the best at what you do. And now there's finally kind of a come around to this idea that they're whole people. And the way you're describing character is very holistic. It's very much about the whole person, not just about goal striving, but to kind of see all the different elements that, what a whole life is really, what a whole life really is. It's not just about persevering and try to be the best at something. So, my question in terms of the audience listening to this, different institutions or families or, counselors trying to understand how to work with this idea of character development, it sounds like part of it is trying to understand what character means to the audience, or the people who are thinking about doing something about, character development. Is it tricky to be able to kind of be on the same page about what is quote unquote good? As we're kind of talking about with athletics, right? There's kind of a sticking point with a lot of coaches and a lot of, institutions about like, what does it mean to have good character? And there could be differences of opinion. So what's your advice in terms of working with institutions, schools, classrooms, any type of culture, to work through that, maybe dissonance between, ideas or what someone says is good, quote unquote good?
Definitely, there's different ways to think about what you want to focus on, and I think that's an interesting thing about the book that we've just worked on the second edition of. Is really there can be different ways that you focus on. Are you a school that wants to focus on moral character? Do you want to focus on intellectual character? It doesn't mean that you have to focus on just one of these areas. You can take something from, one of them and something from another of them. You could focus on curiosity, which is more of an intellectual character strength, and you could focus on, empathy, which is maybe more of a moral character strength. So it doesn't have to be that you box yourself into one of them. You might start with a value sort, something like that. That's something that we work with a lot at the Good Project, where maybe that's like the very initial thing that you start with at a school, and you really sort of think about what are our values and goals as a school, and you build up from there. Another thing that we've talked about before is that there's different ways that people think about the terminology that goes along with character, and whether if you call it character strengths, is that something that's maybe that people don't want to think about it that way in particular, and maybe they want to focus more on the individual character strengths themselves. So maybe it's really thinking about, we want to just talk about curiosity, and we just want to talk about kindness, and we just want to talk about respect. So maybe it's, how you're actually talking about it at the school is more of an inroad for different populations. So it's just thinking about that sometimes. So I think there's a lot of different ways to start that conversation at a school. And it's, again, everything's contextual. So thinking about who your particular population is. But I think it's figuring out maybe starting from those different avenues are sometimes the ways in. But where were you coming at it from, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add on that, so in some ways, what we're trying to do with the Character Compass book that we wrote is create a tool for schools and potentially families and organizations kind of interested in thinking more about what does it mean for what do they want their character focus to look like. And so in the book, what we do is we sort of do these case studies of 4 different schools, that 4 different middle and secondary schools that we see as exemplars of one of those types of character. And so there's a school we call Classical Academy that really is a school that is intensely sort of emphasizing moral character development amongst its student body. And then sort of right down the street from is another school that we call College Bound Middle School that's focusing on performance character. A third school focused on civic character, and a fourth school focused on intellectual character. And I feel like our job as scholars and writers was to capture as vividly as possible what it looked like at these schools to sort of intensively focus on each of those dimensions of character, rather than for us to kind of pass judgment or sort of offer our take on which of these is quote unquote best. By trying to sort of faithfully show, like, here's what it looks like to do moral character work at a school. Here are some of the strengths. Here are some of the limitations. And then here's what it looks like to do performance character at a school. And here's some of the strengths and here are the limitations. I think our goal is for readers to kind of use those case studies to think through what makes the most sense in their context. And as Shelby said, like, that doesn't necessarily mean choosing a single type of character. And I don't think any of those 4 schools would say they only care about moral character or civic character, intellectual character, but they were schools that chose to sort of emphasize one of those types of character. And we thought it would be useful for readers to get to see as vividly as possible what that might look like.
I love the way you did that. And I think it's important. We're using the word strength a lot, right? And it's like, well, what if this isn't my strength? And I think when we think about all these components, there's so many overlaps in so many different ways. And sometimes a good entry point is to think about what are the strengths already, to be able to build on, to focus on and emphasize. It's like the idea of values and acceptance commitment therapy. They talk a lot about, sometimes your values, they might be all a part of you, but some show up more vividly or strongly in different contexts, depending on, your point of life. So it's interesting to think about these character traits and these aspects of the schools. I love how you told the story of the schools and then you highlighted rather than dictated the way you were describing it. I think you did a really nice job of integrating and telling the story that way. And that's often what schools I work with are always asking for. Can you just show me what this looks like? Not only do we have cognitive overload by all the acronyms and all the things that we learn in education, but also, sometimes it's like putting that spotlight on the things that we notice are showing up really well and thinking about how we can amplify them instead of rebuilding or redoing. It's just the intentionality. And I think you highlighted that really nicely.
Thank you. And it occurs to me, I mean, something interesting is that it seems to me like a school community could, two different school communities thinking about their strengths could come to opposite conclusions about sort of what to focus on, right? Like if let's say you imagine a school, you could imagine two school communities that both, like have sort of hard driving, sort of academic achievement oriented spaces, which kind of aligns with the performance character, kind of dimension, right? Like, so you could imagine these schools as places where there's a lot of emphasis on performance character, and you could imagine one school saying, yeah, like we're a place of learning. Like our students are striving to do well. Our teachers are striving to help students do well. Like this is our core value. We should put our sort of chips on performance character. And you could imagine another school, with in the same context saying, hey, like the performance character piece is sort of ingrained in our community already. But what about but I think that would be complemented well by sort of a focus on the civic and sort of making a decision, not because they don't value performance character, but because they feel like, hey, that's actually so integral to who we are as a community that let's think about curriculum and programming to nurture the civic. And so I think it's interesting to think about different school communities kind of making different and equally sort of kind of valid decisions about where to put their chips, so to speak, when it comes to character development.
Well, I wonder if you guys can say a little bit more too about the process of even building the awareness. You mentioned a little bit about like, what is your goal that you're aiming towards to amplify or expand upon in your school community to build this culture. And I think, I think about my work a lot, and I wonder how it resonates with all of you too, is, sometimes people don't even know what their goals are. It's really difficult to identify, like, this is the thing I care about and this is the thing I want to do. It's more of like, so much is dictated in our world right now, in our society, of what we're supposed to be doing and thinking and acting and all of these things. And sometimes it's really in disalignment. So I wonder if you can share a little bit more. I love how you focus on, just building this awareness to even understand what direction to head in. If you could talk a little bit more about either what you captured in the book or what you've been seeing in other research or what you integrate into your own work and lives too, about that awareness goal setting piece.
Yeah, I want to just add real quick before you respond. It's also, I think, similar to what you're saying, is that sometimes we can kind of fall into what feels comfortable. So maybe overemphasize one, let's say, trait or value, right? Just because it is comfortable, but maybe there's, change is hard and being kind of expansive is hard. And even though it might be healthy for an individual or a culture to kind of evolve in some ways, not to completely, as you said, put all your chips into one area. So kind of branching off of Alexis' question, how do you kind of help people become aware of the possibility of other types of virtues and character traits that could also be important within a culture? Because as we've said, especially with social media too, kind of sometimes you can get fixated on one virtue or one value because of the algorithms. That's what they're doing, is they kind of fixate on one thing.
Those are great questions. I have a thought, but Shelby, let me defer to you if you want to start, or if you want me to. It's up to.
Why don't you go first, and then I'll see where mine builds off of yours.
Okay. I mean, so it's interesting, and so I'm doing some work, sort of some research on families and parents right now, like on sort of not totally distinct, but not totally related either. But one of the things I find myself kind of continually emphasizing in sort of this family work is the importance of sort of parents being in conversation. That's the phrase I use, like in conversation with each other about what they're trying to accomplish in terms of their kids' positive development. And I think the same thing is true for schools and institutions, like about the importance of being in conversation. And so I remember, as you mentioned in the introduction, I started as a high school teacher in the Boston Public Schools, and I was actually part of a high school that was going through kind of that went through sort of a very formal visioning process about sort of what it wanted its kind of mission and vision and plan to be for, say, the next 10 years. And one of the things I remember as part of that process that I found really helpful is we had basically a couple like big tent meeting, like big tent sort of convenings, like literally, facilitated by a professional, where we brought together sort of teachers, students, and family members to have kind of conversation about who we want to be, like about sort of who we are as a school and who we want to be as a school. And so I could imagine, for instance, like if I sort of think about that process, and I found that process to be really helpful. I could certainly imagine a world where a school that is trying to sort of make decisions about where it wants to go character-wise, like, or an institution character-wise, to sort of, again, bring together stakeholders, like, and the school has to decide, is that teachers and students, is that teachers, students, and families, teachers, students, families, community members. And I could imagine sort of a series of, conversation, like, let's talk about our moral character, like where the state of the union in terms of moral character in our community, the state of the union in terms of performance character, state of the union in terms of intellectual character, in terms of civic character, and both sort of what are our strengths, what are our limitations, what are our growth areas, like to what extent is this a priority, and then maybe sort of like kind of whether that's, and different communities would make different decisions, right? Like about whether they, about how they sort of come to decisions, but like through those series of conversations, just, making some decisions about where we think we should put our chips going forward. Like, let's take stock of where we are. Let's talk about, our strengths and our sort of growth areas. And then let's talk about, you can't do everything. I always sort of say one of the things, one of the things I say is, when I go into a school, if I see 10 core values, like on the wall, then I'm pretty skeptical, like that's a school that's sort of really sort of doing work on those core values, because I think that's just too many. I just think it's too many. I think given like how precious, a resource time is in school communities and in all of our lives, I'd be surprised if a school is able to sort of say, these are our 10 core values, and we're working really hard on all 10 of them. Whereas if I go to a school and I see three or four sort of focus areas, I think to myself, like, oh, this could be a place that really has made some decisions about who it wants to be, and is pursuing that.
I'm going to jump in, Shelby. I want to hear your response too, but it's making me think about my work as an educational therapist and executive function. So essentially, you're saying, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture of what we have in front of us, take inventory, break it down into the categories that we notice, and then figure out what the plan of what's next is. And juggling too many things, I can't tell you, you probably know this already, but in my work, I have so many conversations every single day with young people with their plates filled of 10 things that they think are the most important things that they have to do every single day and fit into their weeks. So not just for like organizations and schools, but also in our own lives. Like, how do we prioritize? This is such a difficulty across the board, I think, as people in academia who really are curious and care a lot about the work we do, we tend to have long lists of things we're interested in and engaged in. So prioritizing the energy, the time, the focus, it's so important that, like you said, you take stock of what's in front of you before you even decide what comes next.
Mm-hmm. I think, my big takeaway too is just, building in your own metacognition about your own, about your processes, both, we're teaching this to the students, but also doing it ourselves. So I think, something I really appreciate about the new version of the book is that, our looking forward, looking back section, and where we went back and we interviewed principals and students, and we asked them, how did this impact you? Do you feel like the schools had a lasting impact on your character development? Or we asked how things were going. And so, for example, at Bright Ideas Middle School, which is the intellectual character chapter, something they were saying is really, after we've reflected about this, the school's been open for a while. We've realized that, we actually do need to focus a bit more on sort of these, basic social emotional learning skills in addition to intellectual character. And not saying that we're, tossing aside intellectual character, but the school was founded as an intellectual character charter school. That was, how it was created. It didn't turn into that from something else. And so, they've now had time to sort of go back and realize that they needed to build in a little bit more of that sort of as a behavioral management tool in some ways, because they weren't having enough of that along the way. And so I think having that time to reflect and realize that that's something that they also need to prioritize in addition to their intellectual character, because they've had the time to now reflect and really go back to the drawing board a little bit. And just as a side note, I also do a lot of work just in general about intellectual risk taking and intellectual character with my colleague Bedora Suter, who helped us with this edition of the book. And we see that across the board in a lot of the schools that are really focused on intellectual character, where they do that with the students midway through the class, where they really go back to the drawing board and they say, let's talk as a class about our priorities for the character for this class. So I think just again, modeling that ourselves with our priorities.
Mm.
Absolutely. I do want to hear some wonderful examples too from the book and from your experience and your research, almost like specific examples, as you're saying. What does this look like in practice? But before we get into that, I just want to ask a kind of a general question about, from your research, from your, philosophizing, like how is character developed? Are certain people kind of born with certain traits that kind of lead them into one direction of the type of character that they developed, or is it kind of related to personality traits, or in some ways, like being more conscientious is something people have more or less of, and that can relate to maybe persistence or being detail oriented, and some people maybe have more empathy, or how much of it is internally developed and how much of it is externally developed. Through all the influences that are there. I mean, there's so many influences from any level, culturally, societally, family, the people we interact with, our friendship group, like there's so many influences. So how do we think about the development of character? Because I think that's a good starting point before we get into the actual programs and what it looks like to develop it.
That's a great question. I teach an adolescent psychology class at Boston College, and we spend some time talking about like different ways, different answers that different psychologists have to that question. And so some folks think, okay, like if you want to nurture character strengths, like the key is reasoning. Like you've got to sort of engage cognitively with young people and show, hey, like here's if you want young people to act with empathy, for example, then we need to sort of intellectually talk through like what empathy is and why it matters, and sort of you can say here's a dilemma and what does it mean to sort of be empathetic in this situation, and other folks say like nope, like the emphasis isn't necessarily reasoning, but like a focus on care. Like we need if you want to nurture empathy, like what you need to do is sort of create opportunities within schools like for to engage in sort of caring behaviors, like, and to model caring behaviors and to reinforce caring behaviors, like, and that's sort of putting more of an emphasis on the action, right? Like, and then there's these other folks who say it's really about habit, like it's about habit formation, like that there's really no such, they might say there's really no such thing as sort of like empathy broadly, where if you sort of nurture empathy, like you get empathetic behavior across the board. What it is that like you need to like help young people say like to act empathically like in this situation is to do this thing, like this is I'm going to model for you how to hold the door open for a person who needs assistance, right? Like, and I'm going to reinforce that for you, and I'm going to, and that's sort of like that little sort of more schema, that little cognitive schema, like, okay, I've taught that, but I shouldn't expect that to sort of automatically translate into I'm going to I'm going to make a donation to a charitable organization. Like I'm going to have to teach like a different schema, that, hey, like, once a month, like our family sits down and we sort of decide on an organization to make a contribution to, and I'm going to teach that, like, and so those are just three of the, kind of the schools of thought about what does it mean to actually sort of nurture a quality like empathy or integrity or perseverance, like, and so on and so forth. And I think sort of as Shelby alluded to at the beginning, when she kind of made reference to kind of the head, the heart, and the hand, that in truth, like it's probably a combination of all of that, right? Like it's right. Like we need to engage young people in thinking about like, what does it mean to act empathically in a particular situation? We need to model it for them. We need to give them opportunities to practice it. We need to reinforce it. We shouldn't assume that like it will automatically translate from one setting to another without kind of us as sort of parents and educators kind of helping that transference occur. And so
Mm.
those are a couple of the things that we talk about in class when we talk about what does it mean to to support character development.
I love that answer, and it's very integrated. And the more I've gone to become a psychologist and even practice, the integration is so important. And you're saying it's not one thing, and there's different ways to approach. There's different angles to take to support a human being to flourish or to overcome their challenges. And in your case, to develop moral traits. So I love your answer. And it reminds me of some of the bullying research that I did at Boston University when I was a student with Melissa Hull and Jen Green around, bullying prevention. There's no silver bullet. There's not one thing you can do to stop, to prevent bullying, to support the kids who are being bullied. That it's all hands on deck approach. It's creative. It's being looking at it from different perspectives. So it reminds me a lot of that. So I really appreciate your answer. That there's a lot of, and it takes creative thinking to be able to figure it out and individualize it to the person as well.
I'm going to challenge you because I wonder if any of the audience members might be thinking, okay, so we can teach empathy, right? Just by like building it into our repertoire, doing more of it, being exposed to it, practicing it. Would that be a logical, reasonable thing to say?
I would say yes. The research demonstrates yes, but I wouldn't say it's easy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that any of it is necessarily, incredibly easy. I mean, we're talking about habit building here. We're talking about, things that need to be developed over time. They need to be reinforced in different situations. So yes, I'm not saying this is, I have a child who, this is what I do for work. And I'm still like, why do you have a fixed mindset most of the time?
Right, exactly.
This is not something that is just going to happen. But it is something that we see, over time and with, enough reinforcement, enough habit building, we can see changes over time and we can see it develop in students. But it's not a flip of a switch.
Yeah.
So, but I'd say that's all. That's sort of. I'd say teaching is all we've got. Like, I think that's, I think the way all of these character strengths develop is through teaching and modeling and nurturing and conversation. And there's probably a tiny percent. If you think of sort of a spectrum, if you take a quality like empathy, or integrity or perseverance, there's probably some tiny percentage of folks on one end of the spectrum or the other end is, there's some tiny percentage of folks who are just born deeply, deeply sort of sensitive to others, others' needs, and some tiny percentage of people who are totally indifferent to other folks' needs. And we would probably say both the extreme ends of the spectrum is probably, a challenge for folks on both ends. And then I think everybody else, it's all about, what are the learning experiences, in your family, in your school, in your church, in your community, that. Right. That helps you think about what it means to be empathetic and what that looks like and how to do it.
We had Dr. Marianne Wolf on, and she's an expert in reading. And she said something so interesting. She said, reading is actually where you develop perspective taking. And by nature of that, you can develop empathy. And, it's just an interesting context in which we're trying to, help moral and character development within the context of, as we always talk about, kids. She said, high school students there's so many they've surveyed, they haven't even read one full book throughout high school. So not having that deep engagement in reading and being able to take perspective. So as we're all saying, it's so wrapped up in everything we do. It's not just one thing. So there's a lot of ways that we can kind of approach that.
I was just going to say that, I love that you're thinking about the head, the heart, and the hands because, related to neuroscience too, we know that the brain is not just working in isolation in one part, right? To really have learning happen and habits to be formed, we need to have all of these different aspects firing and coming online with repetition, right? Not just once and we're one and done. I'll never forget a story a client of mine told me years ago. He goes to a public high school in the area, and he said, all my teachers tell us to have a growth mindset, to your point. And, we have the posters on the wall, and then I get a bad grade and I ask for feedback to be able to make an improvement, and they tell me my grade is my grade. And I'm like, oh no, such a missed opportunity, right? Because I think it's so important to remember that, we can build in these opportunities in so many of our interactions. A lot of the work I do in talking about building in supports for executive function to strengthen those skills, people are like, what's the thing to do? And I'm like, it's never one thing. It's about how we approach each other, how we approach situations and challenges. And, I always say the intervention is often in the interaction.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And interesting, one of the schools that we focused on, the school Classical Academy, that focused on moral character. Something that was so interesting about them that I remember is, so they offered this sort of weekly ethics class, like where all the students in the school took an ethics class where they focused on the school's core values, one of which was integrity. And so in ethics class, students would be reading and talking about integrity and studying different sort of conceptions of integrity, whether it was like Gandhi or Plato or Dr. Seuss. And something that the educators really wanted to talk to me about is say like, hey, like we see our students like have these incredible conversations about integrity in ethics class, and then school let out and we'll see something happen sort of like, literally on the street in front of the school where like we can see our students like not acting with integrity in that moment. And I say, and they were really sort of interested by that and focused on that and wanting to sort of try to do something about that. And I think it relates to the point you're making that we've been talking about how integrated it all is. Like it's not just one thing, and Jerry a moment ago was talking about, Marianne Wolf sort of talking about reading and like way reading can build perspective taking, which is a key part of empathy. And I'm a former high school English teacher. And so I'm very much on board with the importance of books, like for doing that work. But actually, it's funny, there was this, terrific Harvard English professor, Elaine Scarry, who wrote this essay years and years ago called The Difficulty of Imagining Other Persons, where she was sort of describing a similar phenomena, where she said, like, you can read a book that sort of offers like, that is seeking to nurture like your empathy around sort of a particular topic or group of folks, like, or a single character. And then there are some folks who close the book and act in very unempathetic ways, right? Like, and so I do think it's never going to be just one thing. It's like, it's reading the book. And to your point, Alexis, like the teachers modeling empathy, like in their interactions with the students, and then, the school sort of reinforcing like the importance of acting empathically in the hallway, like, and even when you're outside of school and online and all of those things kind of intertwining.
I was just going to jump in and say there's quite a few different character curriculums or programs around reading and character development. So I know like Dr. Karen Bolin, who used to be at Boston University, she's done a lot of work on narrative and reading and character, and also the Jubilee Center out of the UK has one, which I think is called like the Heroes Curriculum, maybe also. So I just think just to this topic, there's a lot of focus on how can we develop moral character in particular through reading. But I was also going to say that my own team at the Good Project has done a lot of work on role models in particular, and how can we, really focus on who are our role models, and how do they impact us, and not necessarily just ones in books, but that is sometimes who kids bring up. There's a lot of Harry Potter. There's a lot of BTS, which is not somebody that I really know, but a lot of K-pop in there.
Yeah.
So a lot of different people. This was kids all over the world, actually. And so, just again, really emphasizing the importance of who are we looking at and how is that building our character. A really interesting part of that study was just that the way that kids describe character and what is important to them is often maybe not what is important today in terms of how people are describing sort of the important skills for the future of work. So the kids are really focused on, like my role model works really hard, they're hardworking, they're diligent, they're gritty. And that's not really what we are focused on in terms of we want people to be adaptable and flexible and creative. And so that's something we've been really focused on in that study. So.
Yeah. I mean, all these things take a lot of patience, as you're saying. I mean, I'm a therapist. I work with people, so it's like change is hard, as you're pointing out, and it takes it takes patience, and it's almost like it must be that much harder nowadays because kids have, I think, less patience just because of social media and technology has made it so instant, and that's definitely a tricky part of it. I love the idea of role models, and I think identity seems so attached and connected to character traits, almost like the way you see yourself, the classic example of like, I don't want to do that thing because it's not quote unquote cool, when actually that thing could actually be good for you and good for somebody else.
I was encouraged that the top role models were parents still. So
That's wonderful to hear.
Interesting. Can you say more about that?
Well, so particularly, I'll just give you briefly, like the question was, who do you see as like your good work role model? Because that's who we were asking about. But so the top people that they described were their parents. And then that was followed by celebrities, and teachers were in there. And then there were some other people, but yeah.
That's great.
I call it like the Wizard of Oz effect. Like sometimes we need to see behind the curtain of like what it takes to get to this place of being successful or potentially seen as a role model, that it's so important for us as adults to like pull it back and be a little bit more transparent. So young people can see the process. You know, going back to executive functions, they often can't see what it takes or to be able to think into the future of like, well, what will this amount to? I need to see what the outcome is like right away. And I think that's a big challenge with thinking about character development too, especially when, you know, schools try to enact and integrate a lot of these curriculum and these processes that they're like, well, we did it for a year. And, you know, we still have behavioral issues or things going on, or our scores didn't go up. We see this a lot with universal design for learning, because it's like, it's a process, right? It's not just you do it 1 year and see what happens. To see like real change and growth and cultural shifts and changes, it takes such a long time and a lot of dedication. I wonder if you guys can speak a little bit to that and your experiences from the schools you worked with too, because you could get, I don't want to use the word burned out, but you could be like, well, we put in so much of this and now what's next?
In some ways, I think the second edition of our book is kind of like a fun, has like, it like offers some fun thoughts about that, like useful thoughts about that, in the sense that I do think that for, you know, to be a teacher, you know, for that matter, to be a parent, like, you know, there is a leap of faith involved, right? Where you're sort of saying, I'm going to do this modeling work and this practice work and this sort of, you know, feedback work now. And maybe I'll see, you know, sort of immediate returns on that investment in terms of like, you know, growth in whether it's perseverance or gratitude or empathy or integrity or social responsibility, but maybe I won't, right? Like, you know, as Jerry was saying, like these, you know, like sort of making, you know, personal change like takes time, like it happens over time. And so I do think sometimes being a teacher means saying, I'm going to invest this energy and this focus now and sort of not know, you know, exactly how it plays out, like for the majority of my students as they go off into the world, like, but the connection to the second edition of our book is that for the second edition, what we did is we tracked down, you know, a number of the young people that we had interviewed originally in 2012 when they were middle schoolers and high schoolers. It's now, you know, a decade and a half later, they're adults, like they're parents in some cases, they're professionals. And we tracked them down and we sort of asked them, like, tell us a little bit about what impact it had on you going to a school that, you know, a high school that focused on moral character or a high school that focused on intellectual character or so on. And it was really fun. I mean, and I think they were, overwhelmingly, felt like that high school experience had a powerful influence on the people that they are today. You know, there was a young person, you know, working thousands of miles away from, you know, the school that she had gone to, who's now a social worker who does work with who sort of works for the state, like, you know, in terms of, you know, for the Department of Youth and Family Services, in terms of the very challenging work of sometimes separating young people from their parents or sort of supervising young people, like whose parents are being investigated for one reason or other. And she really talked about actually the ways in which the empathy she had an opportunity to think about at that moral character school, you know, influences her sort of on the day to day. Like, and then a young person we spoke to, you know, who had gone to the school focused on civic character, he had actually spent years working as a producer, like on podcasts and sort of entertainment, and, you know, sort of audio entertainment. And then just recently decided to go back to school, you know, to study policy, to study sort of public policy. And he said, in some ways, I feel like I'm reconnecting with that the high schooler that I was. And cool. And he says, and that's a good thing. He's like that kid speaking to himself about himself. He said that kid had it right. And he really said, you know, until it wasn't like until the interview, he had very consciously said to himself, oh, like going to a high school focused on civic character is what's contributing to me, you know, sort of making this career shift in my mid 20s. But as we talked, he sort of he sort of started putting it together and saying like, oh, like this, this really does feel very resonant with who I was as a teenager. And we have quite a number of stories like that.
Can I press pause to highlight this for a second? Because I made mention in the introduction when I was talking about your bio, Scott, about thinking about mixed methods approaches to research, right? This is such a great example of how like the data and the numbers don't always tell the whole story. And sometimes just sitting with people, we have the privilege of doing this every day in our work with the people we work with. But for schools and for parents to sit down and have a conversation and, ask these questions like, what's the thing you remember? What's the thing you're proud of? What's the thing you wish you could do again? Or what is the thing that you carry with you from this experience? It's so rich and it often becomes like so therapeutic. And then, to connect it to, I notice that's something you really value about and brings it back to character. It's so beautiful and just having that opportunity for you guys to go back and interview those students and teachers alike.
And it reminds me so much of how many times we hear, young people who I think we have to remember too, young people are young. I'm kind of saying that facetiously. Like they are still, their brains are developing. They don't know what's going on. They're scared, all these other things going on. And it takes time to mature and to care about certain things and to change what you care about, right? And how many times have we heard as kids get older, like, yeah, I used to hear that either from you as a therapist or you as, you're working with, or parents or teachers or schools. And later in life, they're like, yeah, you know what? Now I understand it. But if it didn't happen, maybe that light bulb moment would have never happened later on in life, as you're saying, Scott. So I think I'm thinking of the word trust, and trust comes from consistency. And as we're going back to the original point or the question about, how does this work over time? How does culture change? How does this system, actually develop over time? That the results may actually not be immediate and they may not be quantifiable. They may be something that's held in the person's heart that later in their life. I think it really exemplifies that trust and that consistency of how we treat other people, even if we don't see the results. And that's why, sometimes we can get burnt out because this work is hard. It's hard. And it's almost like the giving tree. You keep giving and you keep giving and you keep trying. But the results may not be so tangible and they may be delayed, but they may certainly be there in the end in some capacity, even in a small way.
I think the story about, is it classical with the ethics?
Yeah.
Yeah, and their decision they had, this really powerful ethics curriculum. And then, with George Floyd and everything, they decided to shift away from that a little bit. And then, you could probably tell this better than me, Scott, but, and they moved away from it. And then when we talked to them, they were realizing that they wanted to maybe bring back some of that ethics curriculum, and then that they realized that they were missing some of the elements of that, and that they really appreciated some of the ways that built their students' character. And I think that just also speaks to sort of the power of how important it is to be doing these things over time, and not that there aren't things that we can grow and change, and that maybe we need to move with the times, and then we move with, and bring new things in, but also that I think that they realized that, they had built this really important thing over time. So I don't know if you would agree with that, Scott, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it also connects to, that story also connects actually to what we were talking about, a little while ago about sort of institutions kind of, sort of being continually in conversation about what do they want their character work to look like. And so the Classical Academy, the school that we studied that focused on moral character, over about 7 or 8 years ago, as sort of as Shelby alluded to, as sort of the Black Lives Matter movement was rising, some of the faculty at the school started to say, oh, like this ethics curriculum that we built is really very, very white centered in sort of the philosophers and the ethicists that it's leaning on, right? Because it was sort of introducing students to Plato and Socrates and Rousseau and so on and so forth. And so there was sort of a period where the school kind of decided to move away from it. Like they sort of said, like, this doesn't feel like it's meeting the moment that, that we're in. But then just a year or two ago, a new leader took over. And she sort of, as part of her sort of leadership, sort of leadership entry, started talking to alumni of the school, sort of just reached out to alumni at school and said, sort of, did something similar to what we did, where she said, sort of, tell me what was important about your experience. And the ethics curriculum kept coming up over and over and over again, from all of the students that she was speaking to. And I should say this is a school, comprised predominantly of Black and Latino students, which I think sort of contributed to the teachers in sort of 2021, 22 sort of saying, oh, like maybe this isn't the right thing for us. But the alumni were saying like that was something really important for us. And so I think that this leader had sort of the both the leadership skills and the vision to sort of say we can figure this out. The answer isn't to bring back the exact same curriculum that we had in 2012. The answer isn't to drop the curriculum, the ethics curriculum, sort of whole cloth. It's to sort of work in conversation to make the adaptations that make sense for the character work and the school that we want to be right now. And that's kind of happening right now in real time, and I think it's really, really exciting.
What advice would you give to educators, especially because I hear this all the time? They're like, oh, we've got this SEL curriculum, we have this other curriculum, and I also have to teach all this other content, and they're getting kind of burnt down and bringing more things in. I know what I say, but I'm curious about what you all say in how to integrate a lot of this work together. Because as you're telling the story about the ethics curriculum, I imagine they're bringing in, more current events into the room where we can talk about real life situations that connects to what they were learning in the ethics curriculum. I wonder if you can share a little bit about what you suggest to educators in thinking about how to not see this as like one more thing, because we all know the value of these curricula, but how do we help them to better understand the bigger picture value and integrating it all in?
Obviously, I would always if I could make my ideal school, I always think it's great to have time for some explicit learning around character. If you can have an advisory, I talk about that with the Bright Ideas Middle School. Great, love that. But if you don't have that, I think there's so many other ways to try and build it into the time. One thing that they really use a lot at Bright Ideas Middle School is the thinking routines. And again, that sort of goes back to the point of like, we're trying to build the habit of these character strengths, but they also really work really well with, I'm a little bit biased because a lot of them come from Project Zero, but I'm putting that aside. And they, they work really well with everyday material from class. They're both asking you to think of alternative perspectives. They're asking you to ask questions. They're building your curiosity. They're asking you to do different things, but they're surrounded by the actual material from a course. So something like that, which is both allowing you to build different habits and different character strengths, but they're actually using the material of the course. Or doing something as simple as using more group work, which is really asking you to use your skills of empathy and things like that. But, at the same time is focused on doing the actual classwork. So doing things that are more about the pedagogical skills that are actually building character strengths at the same time, but that are really, deliberately focusing on certain character strengths as well, are what I immediately go to.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe what I would add is that, to try to be sort of just really concrete, like, to answer, in terms of answering your question is, I would sort of say to schools, choose a small number of characters. Given that time is such a precious commodity, and as Alexis said, like there's so many sort of responsibilities on educators' plates. I'd say choose a small number of character strengths, like, or core values that like you as a school community can get behind, feel are important, and are willing to spend some time on, even if it's just two. I think that's totally fine. Then I would say take a both and approach to kind of teaching those values or those strengths, meaning have a specific part of the school day where, whether that's advisory or sort of a particular course or a particular sort of, weekly meeting, community meeting, where you explicitly sort of work on teaching what those core values are and what they look like, and sort of recognizing them when they happen. and then also encourage teachers to seek out opportunities to kind of bring those into their curricula, like, and to use that language in their curricula, whether it's like, paying attention to sort of when a character in a book, it demonstrates integrity, or when, a historical figure sort of acts in a socially responsible way, or whether, or for that matter, sort of like demonstrating perseverance, like in solving a math equation. And so you're doing both. Like, there's like an explicit place where you're sort of teaching what these values mean, and you're kind of reinforcing them all, throughout the rest of the school experience. And I think the payoff, for doing that is what you do is you end up sort of establishing what, a character vocabulary, or you end up establishing a vocabulary for talking about important things that happen. Like, all 4 of the schools that we studied, they focused on different types of character, but because they sort of did the work, in their own ways to kind of nurture kids' understandings of their particular brand of character, they had a common vocabulary across the school to talk about challenging and celebratory things. Like, and so, and that vocabulary was different in each school, but they all had it. And so when terrible things happened in the world, the school had a vocabulary to talk about it. When celebratory things happened, like, the school had a vocabulary to talk about it. And I think that was very important for like those schools being sort of healthy places for young people.
I love that. It reminds me of almost like, people being in therapy, they have to develop the language to express themselves to get better.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of a foundation that you're building to be able to process and think critically and so forth. I love that.
And it reinforces all the executive function skills that I'm constantly talking about too, right? How to actually pause and think before we are initiating and enacting, right? How do we build that little bit of inhibition to be able to make decisions that are going to be good for yourself and then also for the broader community.
I like what you said too. I just want to point this out, that it's not just about looking at problems and things going wrong, but also when things are going right. And both things are kind of the full scope of life. And it's important to be able to apply these ideas to the full scope of life, to look for it everywhere.
Well, it's going back to what you said earlier about the schema, right? When we develop that as a schema, as a language, as something we're familiar with, it becomes more automatic. It becomes more of what we just do and how we talk about things. But I love it as a framework and really thinking about, the pedagogical frameworks that we build schools on. It's not just a curricula. It's not just content or assessments we get through. There's like a framework for, how we prioritize things. I don't really want to use the word hierarchy, but it's almost like we can build from there because so many things are connected to this idea of character development. And really, I always say from a positive youth development perspective that we're in the business of helping people become great contributors to their own lives and to the broader, society as we're navigating through this life together, right? It's not just about one thing. It's about how are we helping to develop young people to figure out who they are and what's important to them and where they fit in the world. Because I think at the core of a lot of the things we're seeing in society, that's probably one of the biggest issues, this loss of identity and loss of connection, even in such in such an overly seemingly connected world.
Yeah.
I have go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to note that at Bright Ideas Middle School, and I think this was at many of our schools, that the teachers really had this, practice of noticing and naming when the students were doing a particular character strength. And also this was sort of led into their character ceremony at the end of the week. And so you would see them being like, great curiosity, Ben, for asking that question during class. They would call out, and you would see the students doing it to each other, and being like, oh, that was really intellectually humble of you, Sarah, to name that you didn't know what was going on. And then at the end of the week, they would have a character ceremony where the teachers and the students would do that also for each other and be like, oh, Sarah was really intellectually humble in science class this week, and then they would all clap for each other. And so again, just to be like, they have that language together, and then it's such a great way to be calling out like these really positive things that were happening.
Totally.
Love that so much, planting all the seeds.
Yeah. We're kind of getting towards the end, and this is just so valuable. I don't know if this is answerable as a question or if it's just kind of something popping in my head, but in the way that social media has become so entrenched in people's lives, I'm just curious about, I've heard young people talk about this too, how sometimes like character could be, almost performative in a way that, and I think this probably just gets back to how important real relationships are in terms of developing character. That's really where you can feel it. It's not something that's just kind of on a screen. It's not something that's even intellectualized. It's not even like this conversation could be somewhat intellectualized, but it's really feeling it on an emotional level, as you say, with the heart, when you can see it and know that it's happening in real time and you actually care about that person cares about you. And maybe in this other thought that I was thinking of is just, people being able to disagree and have that character of being able to talk about difficult topics and not kind of just fall into an argument, but rather an intellectual, as you're saying, curiosity to, not immediately kind of put your guard up or attack, but there's an acceptance that there are differences and there's an acceptance of it as kind of a foundation, and then being able to engage in the dialogue, which, in some ways that's how family therapy works, as I see in my practice. But, it's almost like society as a whole is like a big family. I always think like, oh, I think we need family therapy as a society. But how, what are some maybe practical ways that happens in schools where that, that foundation of being able to listen to each other and not immediately fall into kind of, anger and resentment or, putting people down necessarily?
One thing that your question sort of gets me thinking a little bit about is like, we had sort of a conversation earlier about not just assuming that things transfer from one space to the next, and I think that social media, AI, like creates like new spaces that we need to think about sort of what it means to build character in those spaces. And so so just as an example, like, I mean, I think that you sort of alluded to this, Jerry, in some ways. Like, I think that young people and older people can be much crueler to each other, like over social media, than they ever would be in person.
So true.
Like, young people who might, sort of be empathetic, like, in interacting with a person in real life might behave in some pretty callous ways, like when it comes to their online interaction. And so I think that we need to think about like how to sort of build sort of schemas for sort of moral behavior, civic behavior, intellectual behavior, in all of these spaces. These suddenly, to the extent that it counts as a space, like suddenly we have AI, which presents both opportunities for sort of intellectual character exploration around like curiosity, but also could shut down curiosity, right? Like by virtue of just sort of saying, oh, like I can just have this machine answer the question for me. And so I think like I think that we just need to sort of continuously think about how do we sort of take qualities that we care about and help young people figure out what those look like in all of the spaces they inhabit.
And just to the classroom, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but just briefly, I was just going to say that I think part of it is, at Bright Ideas Middle School, they do a lot of practice of having conversations. They have this in the history and English classroom, they do this thing called giving your 2 cents, where somebody gets to come up to the front of the class and just lead a conversation at the beginning of the class about a question that they have. And I give an example of that in the chapter. And then the other kids ask all these questions that they have about that. And so that is the beginning, I think, of having more difficult conversations. And we talk a lot about, this beginning of intellectual risk taking and the idea that you can be wrong, and intellectual humility, that, you don't know everything about that other people are wrong and you are wrong. And so really starting to get all of those norms in the classroom before you have some of these more maybe hot topic conversations in the classroom. And then also just really relying on our norms in the classroom when we have some of those more difficult conversations. And that's one of those ways that character strengths can help us when we've practiced them, being like, curiosity is one of our character strengths. So we need to to practice that right now and be curious about, this other person's opinion. So I think those are just some of the things that I think about.
That's really helpful. And I'm just imagining, being a child growing up with social media, that, as you're saying, like, I could be wrong, you could be wrong, and that's okay. I feel like there's such a perfectionistic, kind of energy in the air for kids growing up. Like, everything has to be perfect, or you have to always be right, or you always have to be a certain way, that it doesn't leave room for that gray area of like, okay, maybe, you're 20% right. Maybe I'm, 30% right. There's degrees of validity and accuracy to what people are saying. It doesn't even have to be who's right, who's wrong. It's almost like, dialectical behavior therapy, suggests like there's a little bit of wisdom in each of what people are saying, and you have to kind of find that wisdom.
I was just going to say that. I was like, it's like DBT.
Right, exactly. And two things could be true, and it doesn't have to be like true or not true. It could be to a degree, or in a context, it could be true. I always find in therapy, like, I'm always trying to find, what does the person really mean when they say that? I was talking to my class the other day about, people who may say prejudiced things. And I said, what do you do when you have a patient who says something prejudiced? I said, well, first of all, you have to be curious about, where is it coming from? Is it truly just genuinely a hateful comment? Or is there something behind it, that's kind of led them to get to the point of saying this? Or are they even not even saying what they really mean? They're just saying that because it's easier to say than what they really want to say, that might be more vulnerable or, more deeply rooted and, from some sort of trauma or some sort of other, things going on inside of them or in their own lives. So I really like the fact that you brought that up. There's different ways to teach these traits, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be, here's what you do or here's an example of it, but let's actually practice what this looks like and model it for other people as well, which is hard to do. I mean, we're also talking about things that are extremely hard for all of us and any human being to do. So, back to the original point that, patience is important and trust and consistency is also important.
I was also I'm going to put this out here, and I'm hoping you all will build on it a little bit more. I'm building on what you said about thinking about high schoolers and adolescents, especially. Oftentimes they'll take things very much at face value. Like, what you see somebody do defines who they are in one situation. And I think we as adults actually tend to do that about young people a lot too. So going back and kind of pulling everything you all have been saying together, there's this idea of we as adults need to model cognitive flexibility and a growth mindset also, in remembering that these young people are still developing. They don't have the experiences. They don't have the trials and tribulations and challenges that they've gone through. And we need to be able to support that. And, Scott, I'm thinking about you in your adolescent psychology class, how you just talk about the fact that, they're still developing, and we expect a lot of them a lot of times, especially here in the Boston area, right? There's, the bar seems high.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I think, Shelby's the perfect person to talk to, because she's working on, intellectual risk taking right now, and the importance of sort of nurturing intellectual risk taking in schools. Because I think mistake making is a hugely important part of learning. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, Shelby, I don't know if you want to run with that a little bit, but it just seems, I agree with you that, like, there's many that young people probably feel less free to make mistakes than would be ideal.
Yeah, I think, my colleague Medora and I are actually working on another book right now that is about intellectual risk-taking specifically. And just the idea that, we need to sort of get back to maybe some of these core ideas of, like, we need to build belonging first. We need to really focus on that so that people feel safe to take mistakes. We need to really focus on student voice. We need to really focus on these ideas of, confusion is okay and problem solving is okay. Exploration. So I can't go through all of it right now, but just some of those core ideas. And even using assessment towards mistake making rather than against it, that we actually want to use it for the idea of mistake making, even with, using retests and things like that. So some of those core ideas.
Love it. Let's amplify all of that. And it comes from this place of having these strong character traits that allow for you to think about and want to, learn from the process rather than just the outcome or moving on to the next thing. Yeah. And all of this is so important. I have a couple other questions, but I'm going to save them for another time because I think we touched upon them, but I'll kind of like pull them into one last big question, maybe, is thinking about the current space and place that we are in as a society and a world where we have so much access to so much information that sometimes, especially for young people, it's hard to like filter a lot of it out. I want to think about and ask you both, from everything that you've been doing, what advice would you give to any adults in the lives of young people to be able to maybe focus on a little bit more, be a little bit more intentional with in helping these young people to filter out some of this excess noise so that they can get back to really who they are, what they care most about, and how they can feel comfortable and safe to express themselves in those ways? It's a big question.
It's a big question. It's a great question. It's interesting. I often find that as a parent myself, that I would be well served to take some of the things that I know are good for schools. I should be doing them in my own family. Like I should be sort of taking those lessons and bringing them into my family. And so just as an example, if I feel so clear that like schools benefit from choosing a small number of core values to sort of focus intensively on, and to really make that the focus of their sort of youth development work, it's probably relatively few families and parents that sort of make a decision about like, these are going to be my couple mountains to die on when it comes to nurturing my child's character and values. But I suspect that advice would be well served in the family as well, right? And to sort of like choose a few things that you're going to sort of constantly be sort of bringing up, like if being kind, for instance, is something that you feel like is just essential to who you want your young person to be, then like let's talk about kindness, like with peers, with grandparents, like with the choices we make around what we eat and so on and so forth, and kind of just make, choosing a couple through lines that are gonna hopefully, I think like kind of by virtue of sort of the having chosen a small number, resonate with your children, rather than sort of just being kind of a constant refrain of all of the things that they could be thinking about at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. I agree totally with that, Scott. I feel like I'm fighting too many battles on too many fronts oftentimes. So I agree with that. I think, just to sort of the question that you asked, so much of the work that I do on character, it always starts with, you have to build belonging first. You have to build trust. You have to build care in the classroom first. There's a reason that I started the Bright Ideas chapter on advisory and trust and care. Even though that's where they teach explicitly, that's the space where they have, this very like one-on-one authentic relationship with their teachers. I just don't feel like I've ever written basically anything about character where I haven't talked about the fact that you have to build relationships and care and trust and have very authentic relationships. And so I too am working on this. So I don't, say anything to anybody that this is not, hard in this day and age, but, we do need to put down our phones. We do need to, we talk about curiosity tangents in the chapter, and, I need to turn my face to my child and let them tell me about that long story at school that maybe I don't want to always listen to. We need to tune in, rather than tune out. So everything is built upon that authentic relationship. So
that's such a great thing to kind of like package this all up in and think about. Okay, one last big question. What's something that you're hopeful for moving forward from each of you?
I would say most of my work, sort of over the last decade or so, is focused on civic character, kind of how we help how schools and parents can help young people think about their responsibilities to others, and I think we're living in a moment. I think we're living in a moment where some of our leaders are demonstrating, extraordinary cruelty. They're really explicitly saying like, we care about some people and not all people. And I think that's very discouraging. And so I guess I'm hopeful that young people, and I've seen, and I've had an opportunity to be around some impressive young people in this regard, will do a lot better. And I think we see that some of the biggest movements, some of the biggest civic movements over the last 20 years have been youth led. Like whether that's the Parkland students, like sort of pushing for pushing for laws that might prevent like sort of school shootings, folks focusing on the environment, folks focusing on racial justice. Like I think a lot of that work has sort of originated with young people, and I think it comes out of a belief that all people have value, and that we have responsibilities to all people. So that makes me hopeful.
Well said.
Mm-hmm. I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, particularly with the work that I'm doing right now in intellectual risk-taking, that we will continue to move towards models of schooling that will allow for more risk-taking, and in particular that will, I think, encourage more curiosity, more confusion, and more acknowledgement of intellectual humility. And I think in that allow for maybe some, maybe more civil discourse and civil engagement, I guess.
It's beautiful.
Absolutely. I mean, what do we have if we have no hope? And I think to echo everything that you've been sharing and all the amazing work you've committed your entire professional life to, is that even if you make one decision in a moment that impacts one person's life, you've done something. Like if you can't rely on something or someone else out there to make changes in the world, that you can perhaps make a difference in wherever your environment is, even if it's small, and young people can realize that they can make a difference. There's someone being mistreated, go over and check in with them. Like something so small like that makes the world of a difference. As a therapist, believe me, I hear it. Just going in to check in with someone, which is a great character trait, is a big thing for one person. And even if it's not changing the world, it's changing that experience for that one person.
I will put in a plug for you guys, because we talked a lot about, the Character Compass book as like a tool for schools to learn a little bit how to, improve character development in their schools. But I would argue that it's really great for a lot of families and caregivers or coaches to be reading too. I see a lot of this in my practice where, kids are trying to figure out which schools to go to, whether they're going to high school or college, or what career path to be taking. And these are a lot of questions about understanding ourselves that they've never really sat with or thought about or had anybody ask them to have an opportunity to discuss. So the more we can just know more ourselves, to be in a position to offer that to a young person, I think is such a beautiful thing. And I, for one, I'm going to speak for Jerry too, we're so grateful for all the work you both are doing, and the positive energy and vibes that you're sharing with the world and showing them what's possible is really beautiful. So we're grateful to have you here today, and also for all the work you do and continue to do, and the commitment you have to this work. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You're very, very kind of you, and very kind to have us on the show. Yes,
thank you so much. Likewise. And thank you so much for having us on the show.
Thank you both. Thanks for tuning in to the ReidConnect-Ed podcast. Please remember that this is a podcast intended to educate and share ideas, but it is not a substitute for professional care that may be beneficial to you at different points of your life. If you are in need of support, please contact your primary care physician, local hospital, educational institution, or support staff at your place of employment to seek out referrals for what may be most helpful for you. Ideas shared here have been shaped by many years of training, incredible mentors, research, theory, evidence-based practices, and our work with individuals over the years, but it's not intended to represent opinions of those we work with or who we are affiliated with. The ReidConnect-Ed podcast is hosted by siblings Alexis Reid and Dr. Gerald Reid. Original music is written and recorded by Gerald Reid. Recording was done by Cybersound Studios. If you want to follow along on this journey with us, the ReidConnect-Ed podcast will be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks each season. So please subscribe for updates and notifications. Feel free to also follow us on Instagram at ReidConnect-Ed podcast. That's ReidConnect-Ed podcast, and Twitter at ReidConnect-Ed. We are grateful for you joining us and look forward to future episodes. In the meanwhile, be curious, be open, and be well.